Hi, my name is Nicolas Cafaro La Menza and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska. Today I will be talking about soybean nitrogen nutrition, three main aspects: the nitrogen requirement for soybean, some emerging nitrogen limitation in soybean, and some considerations for nitrogen limitation in soybean. So how much nitrogen do we need to produce 1 bushel of soybean? Well, the answer is 4.1 pounds of nitrogen per bushel is needed. For example, if we have a crop of 70 bushels, the total amount of nitrogen that that crop should accumulate is about 287 pounds of nitrogen by physiological maturity. That nitrogen is allocated mainly in the seeds because soybeans produce protein, and as you can see, most of that nitrogen will be harvested with the seed in form of protein, and the rest of the nitrogen will stay in the residue. That nitrogen accumulates during the growing season progressively from emergence to physiological maturity. One interesting aspect of soybean nitrogen nutrition is that more than 80% of that nitrogen is accumulated after flowering stage. Now, where all the nitrogen come from? There are two main sources of nitrogen supply for soybean. One of the sources is the indigenous nitrogen, and the other one is the biological nitrogen fixation. In the case of the indigenous nitrogen, the main source of that indigenous nitrogen is the soil nitrogen mineralization. However, there are other subsources like nitrogen left over from previous crops, some nitrogen from the starter fertilizer in some cases. In cases of irrigated fields, you may have some input of that nitrogen from the irrigation water, or could be some shallow water tables providing some of that nitrogen as well. And also we have some atmospheric dry and wet depositions that could contribute to some of that nitrogen. Then on the other side, we have the nitrogen fixation, which is a symbiotic association between a bacteria and the soybean and form those nodules that fix air from the air. And actually 40 to 70% of the total nitrogen in the soybean is being fixed by the biological nitrogen fixation. Although these two sources, usually they complement each other, and for most of soybean fields is enough to produce some soybean yields, in some cases we will see some emerging nitrogen limitation in soybean. And in those cases, it's because there is an asynchrony between these two sources, the indigenous nitrogen supply and also the biological nitrogen fixation. In my experience, especially in Nebraska, we have about 50% of the soybean production under irrigation, and actually where all those cases of nitrogen limitation is actually in fields that they yield more than 70 bushels in general, is where you can expect to see some more nitrogen limitation in those fields. But not all the fields that yield more than 70 bushels have that nitrogen limitation. What we have seen is that usually if those fields have a low amount of indigenous nitrogen, those are the fields that more responded to nitrogen in soybean. Some considerations about this nitrogen limitation is, again, does your field yield more than 70 bushels? If the answer is no, then the nitrogen fertilization is not likely to increase the yields in those fields. And probably there are other management practices that you can check early season, mid-season, late season that Science for Success has, and you can check on them to increase those yields. Now, if your fields are already consistently in 70 bushels and you wonder about the nitrogen limitation in those fields, one of the bad news is that we don't have yet like a research-based diagnostic tool to really identify those fields. From the research that we have done over the last 10 years, about 70% of those fields with more than 70 bushel have some sort of limitations, some degree of limitation of nitrogen. However, only 30% of those fields really responded profitable to that extra nitrogen in soybean. So considering that there is not yet a research tool, it's important to not just fertilize fields that go with more than 70 bushels per acre. Then the other aspect is that in all the fields that we have found with nitrogen limitation, the shortage of nitrogen is about 45 pounds. So while looking at rates, in case of fixing that nitrogen limitation, we know that in the plants it's about 45 pounds of nitrogen. And most of that limitations occur during the flowering period. So with that, I will thank you. And if you have any questions, you can check the link for the fact sheet about nitrogen nutrition in soybean. Thank you.